It is with concern that the Commission takes note of China's announcement to impose provisional countervailing duties on imports of dairy products from the European Union. The Commission's assessment is that the investigation is based on questionable allegations and insufficient evidence, and that the measures are therefore unjustified and unwarranted.
As of this week, China has levied tariffs on European Union dairy products.
China says it's expanding its scope of its anti-subsidy investigation into dairy imports from the EU. It will now expand it to Denmark, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. China launching the investigation into imports of some cheese, milk, and cream from the EU. That's after the EU announced a tariff plan for Chinese-made electric vehicles. Those EV tariffs of up to 45% took effect at the end of last month. Now, the EU is China's second largest source of dairy products behind New Zealand.
The global dairy sector has entered a new phase of trade disruption after China imposed new tariffs on European imports. Experts say it could reshape export flows and intensify the search for alternate export markets. Beijing will collect duties up to 42.7% on select dairy products from the European Union. It includes milk, cream, and high-value cheese. The move is widely seen as retaliation for the EU's earlier decision to levy tariffs on Chinese EVs.
The warning signs appeared long before the figures were calculated. In refrigerated warehouses across Europe, dairy inventories began to linger longer than expected. Milk powder shipments slowed. Butter contracts were renegotiated at the last minute. Cheese exporters noticed delays at ports that had once moved their goods with clockwork precision. At first, these disruptions were dismissed as temporary logistics issues, the kind that came and went with seasonal demand. But beneath the surface, something far more structural was unfolding. China and Africa were rewriting trade rules. For decades, the European Union had relied on predictable access to global food markets, particularly in dairy. Subsidized production, advanced processing, and established brands had allowed European dairy products to dominate shelves from Asia to Africa. Milk powders fed urban populations, infant formulas filled pharmacies, and cheese became a symbol of quality tied closely to Europe's identity. This dominance created confidence, and confidence slowly turned into assumption. That assumption began to crack when new trade frameworks quietly emerged. African countries, working through regional coordination mechanisms, announced revised import standards for dairy products. The language focused on nutrition security, local industry protection, and value retention. China, almost simultaneously, adjusted procurement guidelines, emphasizing diversified sourcing, domestic substitutes, and partnerships aligned with long-term stability rather than historical preference. The effect was subtle at first. European exporters found themselves facing additional compliance requirements. Volumes approved for import were adjusted downward. Long-standing contracts were shortened. Pricing power weakened as buyers gained leverage. What had once been automatic renewals became negotiations. Africa's role in this shift surprised many observers. The continent had long been one of the largest growth markets for European dairy, particularly powdered milk. But African policymakers had grown increasingly concerned about the impact of cheap imports on local producers. Domestic dairy farmers struggled to compete against heavily subsidized European products. Rural livelihoods weakened and dependence deepened. This imbalance became politically unsustainable. New policies prioritized local production, regional trade, and strategic sourcing. Imports were not banned outright, but quotas and quality standards were recalibrated. African processors were encouraged to scale up, supported by investment and technology partnerships, many of them involving China. China's motivation was equally strategic. Food security had become inseparable from national planning. Reliance on external suppliers, especially in politically sensitive sectors, was viewed as a vulnerability. Dairy consumption continued to rise, but sourcing strategies shifted toward diversification. Investments flowed into alternative suppliers and domestic capacity, reducing exposure to any single region. European producers felt the consequences almost immediately. Export volumes dipped, prices softened, profit margins tightened. Industry analysts began calculating the impact, and the figure that circulated most widely was alarming: a potential 42.7% shock to dairy exports tied to the combined effect of African and Chinese trade adjustments. The number became symbolic. It represented not just lost revenue, but lost certainty. A market that had Once absorbed surplus production now signaled limits, storage costs increased, intervention mechanisms were discussed. The sense of stability that had underpinned Europe's dairy sector wavered. Within the European Union, debates intensified. Some argued the shift was temporary, a negotiation tactic that could be reversed with diplomatic engagement. Others warned that structural change was underway. The latter group pointed to Africa's demographic growth, China's long-term planning, and the global trend toward supply chain sovereignty. Africa's internal transformation was central to the story. Rather than positioning itself solely as a buyer, the continent increasingly framed itself as a producer. Investments in cold chains, veterinary services, and processing facilities multiplied. Regional dairy corridors emerged, linking producers to urban markets. Imports were increasingly treated as supplements rather than foundations. China reinforced these developments. Joint ventures supported African dairy processing, training programs improved productivity, technology transfers enhanced quality control. These initiatives reduced Africa's dependence on external suppliers while deepening ties with partners aligned to its development goals. The European Union faced a dilemma. Its dairy sector was built on scale, efficiency, and export orientation. Reducing output risked political backlash from farming regions. Maintaining output without markets threatened price collapses. Subsidy systems strained under new pressure. Public discourse struggled to keep pace. Consumers saw little immediate change on supermarket shelves. Farmers, however, felt the squeeze. Milk prices fluctuated. Contract terms tightened. The disconnect between macro trade policy and local livelihoods widened. China's messaging remained measured. Officials emphasized cooperation, not confrontation. The shift was framed as modernization, diversification, and resilience. Yet the practical outcome was unmistakable. Europe's privileged position was eroding. Africa's stance was equally deliberate. Leaders spoke of fairness, sustainability, and sovereignty. The objective was not to exclude Europe, but to rebalance relationships that had long favored external producers over local capacity. Dairy became a symbol of a broader recalibration. The shock rippled outward. Financial markets reassessed agribusiness valuations. Logistics firms adjusted forecasts. Trade negotiators revisited assumptions, baked into long-term agreements. The idea that rules were fixed gave way to the realization that they were fluid, shaped by those willing to coordinate. Europe's trouble was not collapse, but exposure. Exposure to over-reliance on external demand. Exposure to shifting priorities beyond its control. Exposure to a world where emerging regions no longer accepted inherited trade patterns without question. As the first phase concluded, one lesson stood out. Trade dominance, once achieved, could not be preserved by habit alone. It required alignment with partners' evolving goals. China and Africa had made their goals clear. The European Union now faced the challenge of adapting to a trade environment where influence flowed not from history, but from relevance, and as dairy shipments slowed and negotiations multiplied, Europe confronted a reality it could no longer ignore. The rules had changed. And the markets it once took for granted were writing a new chapter without waiting for permission. The deeper consequences of the shift became visible only after the initial export shock had settled into routine data releases. What first appeared as a sudden downturn in dairy shipments gradually revealed itself as a long-term structural adjustment that challenged how Europe understood trade, agriculture, and influence. The 42.7% figure no longer felt like a projection. It began to look like a baseline across the European Union. Dairy cooperatives reassessed expansion plans. Processing facilities that had been designed for constant export growth now operated below capacity. Cold storage filled not because of abundance, but because of uncertainty. Milk collection continued daily, yet its destination was no longer guaranteed. The rhythm of production remained intact, while the rhythm of demand fractured. Africa's trade recalibration accelerated quietly. Regional blocs refined import frameworks that favored intra-African sourcing first, strategic partners second, and legacy suppliers last. The language used was careful and technical, but the intent was firm. Dairy imports would support food security without undermining domestic producers. Powdered milk, once a staple import, faced stricter limits as fresh and locally processed alternatives expanded. These policies were reinforced by investment. New dairy zones emerged across East Africa, Southern Africa, and parts of North Africa. Cooling infrastructure reduced spoilage. Veterinary networks improved herd health, feed supply chains stabilized, milk that once could not reach urban markets now arrived consistently, altering consumption patterns and reducing dependence on imports. China's involvement remains systematic rather than dramatic. Rather than dominating headlines, Chinese capital flowed into logistics, processing technology, and financing mechanisms. The focus was not on replacing European dairy with Chinese exports, but on strengthening alternative supply systems that reduced overall vulnerability. In some cases, Chinese demand absorbed African surplus. In others, domestic consumption absorbed production growth. This multi-layered approach insulated both Africa and China. Supply shocks that once would have forced emergency imports were now absorbed internally or regionally. Price volatility declined, planning horizons extended. These outcomes reinforced confidence in the new trade rules and reduced incentives to revert to old patterns. European policymakers faced mounting pressure. Dairy-producing regions demanded support, while budget constraints limited options. Intervention purchases reappeared in discussions, but memories of past surpluses loomed large. Export subsidies risked triggering disputes. Environmental targets constrained expansion. Every option carried trade-offs. Public debate grew more introspective. The question was no longer why Africa and China had shifted, but why Europe had failed to anticipate it. Analysts pointed 2 years of assuming market access as permanent. Subsidy structures encouraged overproduction without sufficient diversification. Trade diplomacy prioritized maintenance over adaptation. The concept of shock evolved, initially framed as an external blow, was increasingly understood as an internal vulnerability exposed. By external change, the 42.7% decline was not caused solely by new rules abroad, but by rigidities at home. Africa's confidence continued to rise as domestic dairy sectors stabilized, governments gained political space to refine policies further, import rules became more sophisticated, balancing nutrition needs with industry protection, consumers adjusted as locally produced dairy improved in quality and availability. China observed these outcomes with interest. The success of diversified sourcing validated long-standing strategic assumptions. Dependence could be reduced without sacrificing growth. Partnerships could replace pressure. Trade resilience could be built quietly without confrontation. European exporters attempted repositioning, some targeted premium niches, emphasizing specialty. Cheeses and branded products less sensitive to volume shifts. Others explored new markets, though competition was intense. The era of easy surplus absorption had ended. Financial institutions adjusted risk models. Dairy sector lending incorporated export volatility. Insurance premiums reflected political risk. Investment decisions slowed as uncertainty replaced optimism. These changes reinforced the sense that the shock was systemic, not cyclical. Africa's broader trade posture was affected as well. Success in dairy emboldened policymakers to apply similar principles to other sectors. The message was consistent. Imports should complement development, not undermine it. External partners were welcome, but on terms aligned with long-term goals. China's alignment with this philosophy deepened trust by supporting African capacity rather than dominating markets. China positioned itself as a stabilizing partner. This contrasted with older trade relationships perceived as extractive or unbalanced. Europe's diplomatic engagement intensified. Talks emphasized cooperation, sustainability, and shared standards. Yet restoring lost ground proved difficult. Once local industries gained footing, reversing protection became politically costly for importing countries. The global dairy landscape adjusted, production centers diversified, trade routes shortened, regional markets strengthened. The dominance of any single exporter diminished, replaced by a more distributed system. For Europe, the lesson was sobering. Competitive advantage rooted in subsidies and scale proved fragile when confronted with coordinated policy shifts elsewhere. Influence required alignment with partners' evolving priorities, not reliance on historical patterns. The 42.7% shock became a reference point. It symbolized the moment when assumptions broke, when markets once considered secure became conditional, when emerging regions demonstrated the capacity to shape trade rather than simply respond to it. Africa's role in this transformation was no longer marginal. By asserting control over import rules and investing in domestic capacity, the continent altered its position in global food systems. Dairy, often overlooked in strategic discussions, became evidence of a broader shift toward economic sovereignty. China's role remained strategic. Rather than visible, its influence lay in patience, financing, and systems building. By avoiding abrupt gestures, it allowed changes to embed themselves naturally, making reversal unlikely. Europe confronted adaptation, reforms to subsidy structures, diversification strategies, and trade diplomacy moved from theory to necessity. The path forward required accepting a multipolar trade environment where leverage was shared. And stability depended on mutual benefit. As the second phase of adjustment settled in, the narrative changed tone. There was less panic, more realism, less denial, more analysis. The shock had passed, but its imprint remained, reshaping how Europe approached agriculture, trade, and its place in a world where rules were no longer written by habit. And beneath the spreadsheets and policy briefs, one truth persisted: global trade had entered an era where coordination could outweigh scale, and those who adapted early would define the next balance of power.